Welcome, everyone. I think some people are still joining, but we wanted to go ahead and get started. Thank you for being here. My name is Kristen Clements. I work for the Housing Department in San Jose. We're glad that all of you have joined us today for our 10th public meeting on the Community Opportunity to Purchase proposal. We've been holding public meetings back to late 2021, and after a 5-month hiatus where we had to work on the housing element, the draft that's due, we resumed last fall, and that followed a long process of a 7-month stakeholder process with 2 different types of groups that met regularly to help design, co-design, and give feedback to the proposal. So we are bringing forward today a slightly revised proposal since we last had public meetings, 2 of them in December. And we're glad that you're here. The whole point of COPA is to help mitigate displacement in San Jose, and which is really an urgent need. So we've been working kind of feverishly on this, and glad that you're here. We would like to hear from you today and give feedback. And to set the stage, we'll be doing public meetings in January, maybe a little bit in February, with a plan to take this forward to Housing and Community Development Commission this spring, and then Council Committee, and then the City Council before the end of the fiscal year, before the break. So we're glad you're here today, and we look forward to hearing from you. And I will turn it back to Elizabeth. Thanks.
Thank you. Welcome. My name is Elizabeth Guzman. I'm also on the policy team in the Housing Department. We're just going to go over some logistics and the agenda before we get started. So next slide, please. We're going to introduce our interpretation services. So if we can have one of our Spanish interpreters make an announcement. I think Felipe or Rosario, you must not be able to get out of the channel because we can't hear you. So just give us one moment here.
I'll add while we're waiting that today's meeting is going to be interpreted into 4 languages plus English. We have Spanish, we have Vietnamese, we have Cantonese and Mandarin. So thanks to the interpreters for being here, and Elizabeth for working on the logistics. It's a little complicated when there are this many folks to translate or interpret. So we appreciate your patience.
Okay, Felipe or Rosario, I've asked to unmute. Are you able to talk?
Maybe just for expediency, I can make a quick announcement in Spanish. I'm not going to be able to do it in any other language.
So
You need to disable the channel.
Elizabeth, you need
Bên
to,
nhà tôi sẽ thông báo bằng
you
tiếng
need
Tây Ban Nha ở đây để cho
to
nhanh
kick them out
chóng.
of the channel
Và
Yeah.
bây giờ thì Elizabeth sẽ chịu trách nhiệm
because I
về
can
kênh
hear
này
them
đúng không?
in the
Bởi vì
English
chúng
channel.
tôi có thể nghe được bà ấy trong phần dịch.
Okay, so apologies. Yeah, I just had to end.
Đúng rồi.
So interpreters stop
Và
interpreting
Tay Kiệt thì có thể
ngừng
for the
bản dịch.
moment
Chờ một chút.
because we're all in the main room now. So apologies, but I had to get everybody, all the interpreters into the main room, and then I can relaunch it. So apologies for that. But if we can just go one at a time, Spanish, if you can make an announcement about interpretation.
Para poder utilizar el servicio de interpretación es necesario ir al menú que tenemos en la parte inferior de la pantalla, elegir el icono del globo terráqueo, elegir su idioma de preferencia, inglés o español, de preferencia elijan un canal y silenciar el audio original si no quieren escuchar el audio original. Es todo, gracias.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Vietnamese.
Chúng tôi cung cấp phần thuyết trình này qua nhiều ngôn ngữ khác nhau. Để chọn nghe tiếng Việt, vui lòng làm như sau. Nếu dùng máy tính, bước 1, hãy tìm nút phiên dịch Interpretation có biểu tượng hình địa cầu trên thanh công cụ của quý vị. Bước 2, sau khi đã bấm vào nút này, hãy chọn tiếng Việt. Bước 3, biểu tượng ngôn ngữ của quý vị sẽ thay đổi và quý vị sẽ nghe tiếng Việt. Nếu dùng điện thoại, hãy làm như sau. Bước 1, hãy bấm thanh âm thanh John Audio và bấm gọi qua Internet, Call over the Internet. Bước 2, bấm vào dấu 3 chấm. Bước 3, bấm vào phiên dịch ngôn ngữ Language Interpretation và bấm chọn tiếng Việt rồi bấm nút Done. Thank you. Cảm ơn.
Thank you. Next slide. Mandarin.
大家好，欢迎参加本次会议。我们会提供西班牙文、英文、普通话、广东话和越南语的翻译。那么在我们说完这些说明之后，翻译频道的地球图案才会出现。如果你想选择普通话的话，那么您可以选择是法语频道，因为中文是广东话，所以如果您使用笔记本电脑呢，就在屏幕底部找到一个地球形状图标，然后点击语言翻译，选择法语频道。如果发言的时候，请放慢速度，能够让我们跟上您所说的内容。谢谢。Thank you.
Thank you. Cantonese.
係，大家好，我哋今日會提供廣東話嘅即時傳譯服務。咁麻煩咧，大家一陣間咧喺屏幕下方咧會見到一個地球儀嘅圖標，寫住 Interpretation 口譯。到時候咧，你撳一撳可以選擇不同嘅語言。如果你想聽廣東話嘅話咧，請撳 China。
Okay, so I've landed, excuse me, I've launched the interpretation channels. So, and closed captioning is available. So if there is an issue, if your interpretation is not working for you, please raise your hand and we will, we can make a pause and make sure that you're able to hear in your preferred language. If you're an English speaker, please select English from the globe so that you can hear translated versions if a speaker and non-English speaker speaks. Thank you. Next, we're going to do a land acknowledgement.
Elizabeth, excuse me, I see somebody with their hand raised, but I believe David speaks English. David, is everything okay with your connection? Do you have any issues right now?
Yeah, yes, it is. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So we, the City of San Jose Housing Department, acknowledge that San Jose sits on the ancestral lands of Native people, including the Moequa, Ohlone people, and Aboriginal homeland of the Thamian Nation. We recognize the resilience of Native culture and community. Let us acknowledge with respect all Indigenous peoples as they have stewarded this land throughout the generations and not forget the painful history of colonization. The Housing Department acknowledges this history as we work towards a more equitable and inclusive future. Thank you. Next slide. Here's our agenda for today. We are going to give an overview of where we are in the process of COPA. We'll revisit the purpose of COPA. We'll give a presentation on the revised draft framework and time for Q&A and then wrap up next steps. Sort of our timing for today, we should wrap up our presentation at the 3 o'clock hour and we'll be here until 4. So we'll have about an hour for question and answer. You may have noticed that we have disabled the chat and we have everyone on mute during our presentation. We've just are doing that after we've received feedback that the chat can be really distracting for people during the presentation, but rest assured, once we get to the Q&A portion, we'll open up the chat and we'll open up for questions. So next, let's just do a round of introduction from our speakers. Heather, would you like to start?
Sure. I'm Heather Bromfield. I'm a fellow with a partnership with A Base Future, and I've been working with the policy team at the Housing Department since June of 2022. I'll pass it over to Kristen.
Hi, Kristen Clements. I'm a division manager in the housing department. We're glad Heather's been working with us. And I will pass it over to the rest of our policy team. Let's go with Josh.
Hi, Josh Ishimatsu, he, him. I manage our policy team for the City of San Jose Housing Department. I'll pass to Elizabeth.
Thanks, Josh. We also have Karen Westmont and Minnie Nguyen from our staff who are here helping us tonight. So thank you. Next slide. So here's where we are in the process. If anyone is new to this topic, we have been working on this for some time. Back in September of 2020, City Council approved the citywide residential anti-displacement strategy, which included specific direction to explore COPA. The following spring, we launched an extensive stakeholder and community engagement process where we engaged and spoke with over 500 people in 50 different meetings, ranging from larger public meetings to stakeholder, smaller type meetings. And then we had to take a bit of a pause this year due to housing element work and staffing capacity. We resumed COPA research and began revising our draft framework this last fall. We've presented a revised draft framework to you all last fall, and that's where we're at today. I will mention that we have, based on feedback that we got at our last meetings in November, we have made some changes again to the draft framework. We don't have those available publicly yet, and we should in the next day or two, but we have been occupied, our staff and our management, by storm response in the last few weeks since the beginning of the year. So a bit behind on that, but like I said, we should have that out in the next day or two. So we appreciate your patience and consideration for that. And then in this spring, the projected timeline is to go to HCDC and CED and then to full City Council. Next slide. I can revisit this before we start our Q&A portion, but I just would like to mention that that we asked all participants here to exhibit respect for each other and for our speakers. Disrespect could include interrupting, swearing, and personal attacks. And we ask that you avoid distracting side conversations. And as I mentioned before, we have turned off the chat during our presentation, and we will reopen it during the Q&A. Again, but please do raise your hand if you are having any issues with interpretation. And I do see that there we have a couple of hands raised. Okay, Cheryl, I see that your hand is raised. Does this have to, do you have a question about interpretation?
Yeah, just a quick question. You mentioned that there's been changes. Are you going to go over those changes today and let us know as you go, or are you just giving us a heads up that there will be changes coming up that we can look at later?
No, we'll go over them today. They're just not, we don't have them in text form.
Okay, and you'll let us know whenever you talk about it, which ones are actually the changes, so we don't have to figure it out.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. That was it.
Okay. Yeah. Again, appreciate your questions, but let's limit them right now just into questions if you're having issues with interpretation. So next, I'll just hand it over to Heather to get us started. Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. We can go to the next slide. We're starting off this presentation by reviewing the conditions in San Jose that are prompting the housing department to propose a COPA policy. So next slide. COPA is an anti-displacement policy, and the reason that we know that there's displacement that is happening in San Jose is because the Urban Displacement Project at UC Berkeley has been studying the issue of displacement for years. So in their analysis of demographic changes as well as housing condition changes, they have a methodology to determine which neighborhoods are being impacted by displacement, and the methodology was used to create the map that you're currently seeing. All of the colored areas on the map are areas where displacement is probably or definitively occurring. So it's an issue that is affecting areas across San Jose, including almost every council district. It affects both low income and very low income renters. So low income defined using state and federal definitions as currently being households earning up to $92,000 a year for households of one person. Very low income being defined as earning up to $59,000 a year for one person household. So according to their research, displacement is impacting both of these groups in different areas of the city. Next slide, please. So the map on the previous slide shows where displacement is happening geographically, but it does not show who displacement is happening to. So families of color, especially Hispanic and Latinx, Vietnamese, and African-American families disproportionately live in areas where displacement is definitively or probably occurring. This chart is showing that while only 13% of non-Hispanic white residents live in areas where displacement is definitively or probably occurring, the same is true for 45% of Hispanic and or Latinx residents, 34% of Vietnamese residents, and 30% of African American residents. So there's a disproportionate racial impact of displacement. And this is not coincidental. This is because of the historical legacy of redlining and other uneven public investments, including investments that the city of San Jose made across different communities, disproportionate investments in communities of color, in white communities relative to communities of color. As a result, to this day, we still see lower rates of homeownership for communities of color, and these communities are also more likely to live in areas that are undergoing the rapid reinvestment that can price out lower income renters. So next slide, please. So one of the many reasons that displacement matters is that not all residents can find new homes if they are displaced from their current residence. So in 2018, the Urban Displacement Project did a study of over 100 families who were at risk of displacement in Santa Clara County. And then they tracked the outcomes for them. So of the families who were displaced, 25% of the families went on to experience some kind of homelessness. The popular idea of homeless is of people who are either in a shelter or who are unsheltered outside. However, according to various homelessness programs, additional definitions of homelessness include couch surfing, include living in a garage or a hotel. These are also forms of homelessness. So it is also common that people will either wind up in shelters or on the street after a period of time living in, a couch surfing arrangement or, living in some other intermediate non-satisfactory housing arrangement like in a garage. We bring this up in the context of this presentation because it's clear that anti-displacement programs and policies are homelessness prevention. So anti-displacement is essentially intervening upstream before families even can become homeless in the first place. Next slide, please. So we also want to contextualize where COPA sits among other types of affordable housing programs and policies. So among how the community of housing policies, affordable housing policy specialists, there's three categories for thinking about affordable housing programs and policies. These are the 3 Ps. They include production, preservation, and protection. So production refers to the new construction of affordable housing, either in standalone 100% affordable buildings, or when new market rate buildings, sometimes a set of the units will be set aside for affordable housing. Those are both production strategies. Preservation refers to acquiring existing apartments at fair value and making them affordable. COPA is intended to facilitate preservation, so it is a preservation strategy. And then finally, there's protection and a few examples of policies that the city of San Jose has adopted that are protection policies, including the apartment rent ordinance, which is our rent stabilization policy, and the city's tenant protection ordinance, which requires that landlords it can only evict tenants in the event of one of a list of just causes. So we bring all of these up because these policies are considered complementary to one another. There's consensus among folks in the affordable housing community that we need all of these types of strategies in order to improve affordability. And so it is not an either or strategy. It is, we need to pursue all of these complementary strategies. Next slide, please. I'm just going to review the goals of COPA before we get into more of the details of the policy. So, COPA is intended primarily to prevent the displacement of lower income renters. It's intended to grow the amount of permanently affordable housing in San Jose. It is intended to empower tenants with the knowledge to participate in the property acquisition process. And it is intended to provide tools and support community ownership opportunities and other asset building opportunities. All right, sorry, I think we have someone who unmuted themselves. If we can just go to the last slide for my section. All right, and so just as a reminder, this is all should be familiar information for many of you who have attended some of these presentations, but the way that COPA works is that affordable housing providers would get the opportunity to make the first offer to purchase 2 or more unit apartment buildings before they are listed on the open market. If an owner decides that they do not want to accept this offer and they reject this offer from the affordable housing provider, COPA then allows them to list their property on the open market, receive offers from third-party buyers, but it does provide the right for the same affordable housing provider to make a final counter offer for any third-party offers. COPA, however, in San Jose would not require the sellers to accept that counter offer. So COPA in San Jose only includes the right to make the offer and the counter offer. Who the owner ultimately sells to remains up to the owner. And with that, I'm going to pass things off to Kristen.
Thanks, Heather. Next slide. So as we said, COPA is an anti-displacement strategy. It acknowledges that buildings that are going up for sale can cause stress and disruption and displacement for existing renters. When properties are purchased, rents are frequently raised and existing residents can be displaced. And because so many households in the city are really housing cost burdened, these people struggle with even a 5% rent increase. That's allowable under our rent stabilization program as an example, but especially when they come layer on layer, year after year on top of each other, it can be extremely difficult for people to stay in place. So the idea behind COPA is that a purchase by a nonprofit developer would allow these families who create the possibility of families who are already housing cost burdened could have their rents more in line with their incomes. So we're calling that right-sized. And so the housing becomes more affordable for them. This stands in contrast to what happens when for-profit investors or buyers typically acquire a property. They're looking to maximize value as they should because of the type of organization they are. But they have a different set of incentives when it comes to buying a property and rehabbing it. It's usually so that greater rents and greater revenues can be obtained from the property. So this is just promoting a different focus. Not that there's anything wrong with for-profits. It's that this is just promoting the tenant's stability first. And when we look at the program from a racial equity lens, as Heather had noted, we know that displacement pressures are mostly due to increases in housing costs or related issues. They are displacing former San Jose residents, and it is disproportionately non-white San Joseans who bear the burden of these stresses. We know that the data says that non-white San Joseans are generally more likely to live in multifamily buildings, and that Latino, Latina, and Latinx families are twice as likely to live in small multifamily buildings than are white families. Black San Joseans are the least likely to live in single-family housing of any other major racial or ethnic group. So we know what happens to multifamily apartments when they also disproportionately affects non-white residents in San Jose. And so we need to work on this issue from an equity perspective. Next slide. COPA would remove the barrier for mission-driven affordable housing developers to engage in housing preservation work. The two major barriers that these folks experience when trying to acquire properties are that market timelines move quickly, and that does not match the funding sources that affordable housing developers need to assemble in order to keep the rents low. Money from the from the public sector and from nonprofit lenders, community development financial institutions are usually the sources for older buildings that are becoming restricted affordable. And it takes longer to get commitments for that kind of financing than in the private market or through private banks for market rate units. It's just a different timeline. Also, affordable housing developers and developments need to be underwritten on a project by project basis. They do not get pre-approved like single family buyers would, even for small sites. When you would hope that that could be the case, it's generally not, because we look at feasibility from a rental perspective, and it still takes underwriting on a deal by deal basis. So COPA would help with the market timeline pressure that these folks experience. And also the second item, market transparency. We know that units, buildings with 5 or more units, they're often sold within brokerages, and there's no one listing service like there is for single family homes, like the MLS listing. So while affordable developers, of course, do use brokers, they would not be aware of transactions that are not listed publicly, or those sold within the brokerage that they happen to be going with. And so it does not maximize the opportunity for them to get the right kind of purchase in the right neighborhood to help stabilize people who are at risk. These issues can't be resolved just by the city providing a technical assistance to people to help them acquire. It also can't be solved by just the city putting out funds to help people acquire. So the right to make the offer is the important thing. Next slide. And as Heather said, all 3 Ps, production, protection, and preservation, go together when you're trying to prevent displacement. I often think about it in, if you ever took economics or talked about markets, in theory, we could produce our way out of this difficult housing market that we're in if we just built and built and built. But reality and data tells us that even if we built and built and built market rate units, that is not going to be enough to get prices and rents lowered to the extent that are needed for people in our market who are low income, very low, or extremely low. So unlike policies that focus on the production of affordable housing, COPA can create opportunities for tenants to stay in their homes and stay in their neighborhoods when property owners move to sell. So that meaning they don't have to move in order to find affordable housing. So kids can stay in their schools, households can retain their ties with other family members or neighbors, their daycare providers, and their community organizations that are part of their lives. We'll also note that preservation, working with existing buildings, of course, is faster than building new affordable housing. It does not mean this is the only thing that we do. Again, we have to fire on all cylinders to help solve our housing crisis, but it is lower cost than building new. And it's important to, it's good from a community building perspective at the same time. Next slide. I just want to clarify here that, as we start to build an acquisition and rehab practice in the city and a preservation presence that we have not had before, like most other cities have had, frankly. It is important to note that we are not the only ones thinking about these issues. And, you know, the lack of consistent funding has really been a barrier for those developers that have wanted to do this work more. COPA itself is just the right to make offers. We're thinking of it as a three-legged stool. Another leg of the stool is to make sure that the city regularly offers funding for acquisition and rehab. And that first bullet, we think it's important that we play locally with that funding, that we offer it, because we believe, based on all the meetings and intelligence that we are hearing, that there is significant state and regional funding potentially over the next few years that is anticipated for the preservation uses that are as important. So the entire system of preservation is growing in importance and growing in size. So it's important that San Jose also offer these kinds of opportunities so that our funds can better leverage other people's dollars and result in buildings being able to be acquired by nonprofits if COPA is in place. So COPA goes hand in hand with funding. Trying to give estimates of how much of an impact that this could make. Well, it really depends on how much funding is available, right? So if we were thinking about only, you know, offering locally $5 million a year, it would, in the immediate near term, we would end up getting 10 or 15 units a year potentially. But if that amount that could be provided by the public sector, maybe it's the city plus the county or the city plus the state, but if that much of an allocation was available, then we would be getting more 80 to 160. So it depends, you know, if you, under some calculations, given what the sizes of offerings are by other funders, this could get to, you know, in the high 300s to maybe 400 units a year. But it really depends on all the players kind of moving forward together. But as we've talked to folks, they know that they've said that having the acquisition rehab presence in San Jose and regular sources of dollars are the most important things. Next slide. In creating this program, we looked strongly to other cities that had similar programs in place. Washington, D.C. has been in the news lately because they have a long track record, but giving tenants opportunities to purchase buildings directly. And that's largely because they have had decades since the late 70s. The assistance and the funding that has come to tenant organizations. And when the city also put in funding for these acquisition rehabs, the numbers went up a great deal. So since between 2015 and 2018, as an example, in Washington, D.C., they preserved over 2,000 units and made them into affordable housing. So DC is an example to look to, just that the idea that funding can really help scale how many units can get done. It's really the essential ingredient. DC also has the development, and has experienced this over the last few decades, of limited equity cooperatives that are tenant-led. And they have organizations that have developed in the market to help tenant organizations to form and to offer, to make purchase offers on the buildings that they already live in. So it's a different iterated market, but we look to it for some lessons. Closer to home, San Francisco put in a community opportunity to purchase program, which is a much faster timeline than the DC program. And the number, Cheryl asked, how will we know when things are new? You'll see things in different color fonts than previous presentations. We got an updated number from San Francisco. They've preserved 234 units as of, with recent data, since 2019, and that includes COVID, where the volume was lower. And units, of course, are costing a lot less than new construction, 30 to 50% less than new construction would have. One of the things they've been talking about in San Francisco with that program is that lengthening the period of time that nonprofits have to issue that letter of intent, which says, I'm interested in making an offer on your building, that would be important and would significantly increase the number of properties that could be acquired under COPA. So as we look to San Francisco, while the timelines are fast, one of their takeaways is it needs to maybe slow down a little bit at the beginning to really maximize the effectiveness of the program. Next slide. And now I'll hand it back over to Josh and to Heather to review the revised frameworks, and starting with Josh.
Thanks, Kristen. Next slide, please. So just to review quickly where we're at, as Kristen and as Elizabeth have summarized, we have been in the process of engaging public and key stakeholders around our city COPA proposal for almost 2 years now. We've heard back and discussed this potential program with hundreds of people, including but not limited to apartment owner representatives, tenant advocates, the San Francisco Housing Department staff who worked on COPA, who are working on COPA up there, local affordable housing developers, and community development financial institutions, CDFIs, the staff of these organizations. And we've also been conducting our own research and data analysis. We last presented a draft framework in November in 2 public meetings, November of last year, one online and one in person. So this presentation, we'll be presenting again the entire framework, but we'll also be including changes that we made in our program since November, based on public feedback, additional conversations, and additional research and analysis. Next slide, please. So in doing all of that, today we'll be presenting about the following elements of the COPA proposal: applicability, what properties are covered, timeline, so what amount of time is each step of the COPA process supposed to take, Q&P, so qualified nonprofit organization qualifications, what type of nonprofit organizations will be certified to participate in COPA. Next slide, please. So tenant engagement. So how will COPA support tenant education and empowerment? And also some items about implementation of COPA. If it's passed, should COPA be passed by the City Council? And finally, because of interest expressed by attendees at the November public meetings, we added a couple slides about home ownership, and what COPA could do to support home ownership or different alternative options of home ownership for lower income residents. And just to stop right here, and one thing to note about the presentation is to please notice that the home ownership bullet is in this purplish pinkish color. So to get to Cheryl's question at the beginning, where we've made modifications from the last presentation in November, we've tried to highlight the text on the slides in this color, and we will also be pointing it out verbally, but also to give a visual cue in the presentation itself. So next slide, please. So let's just get into it, starting with applicability. So the first element, applicability, is about which types of properties that COPA would apply to. So the first 4 items on the slide are in black text. And like I said, these all are all items that were part of staff's previous version of the COPA proposal. So COPA would apply to the sale of all rental properties with the following exceptions. So the exceptions are 2 to 4 unit properties where the owner lives in one of the units of the property as their primary residence. Any transfers of a property to a direct family member of the owner, properties which are being sold as part of a foreclosure or bankruptcy, and partial ownership transfers where control of the property is not passed. We've also added new, any properties would be accepted from COPA if they were built within the last 15 years. This was actually something that we discussed in November, but we're highlighting it and pinking it again just because it's a pretty big change, and we just want to make sure that people are aware of it. So, you know, properties built within the last 15 years means newer properties that are already likely to have higher rents because they are typically entered into the market at the top of the market. So this means that there will be both less likely to house lower income tenants at risk of displacement, and that they are also going to have a higher average per unit sales price, meaning that nonprofit buyers are less likely to be interested and able to purchase these. Next slide, please. Next slide again. Yeah, thanks. So this next section is about timeline. And so there's a chart we've outlined in the first column, the different periods of the initial stages of a property transaction, a hypothetical property transaction under COPA. And second column is the number of days. And third column, wait just a second here. So third column is, you know, we have some notes in the third column. I'll talk a little bit about those as we go along. So can we advance this? Can we advance the slide once? Yes, thank you. So yes, keep it right there. So so initially a qualified nonprofit would have 15 days to submit a letter of intent to make an offer. If no qualified nonprofit submits a letter of intent, then property owners can take the property to market as an owner currently would do. We anticipate that the majority of properties would follow this pathway, that they would not receive a letter of intent. However, for properties that do receive a letter of intent, there would be an additional 25-day offer period where interested qualified nonprofits would submit offers on the property. The property owner would be free to accept or decline these offers. And if the property owner doesn't agree to any of these offers, then they can take the property to market as the owner currently would do. So, you know, together, you know, as bracketed on the slide, the maximum time that property owners would be required to wait before advertising, before putting their property on the market, would be 40 days total. And again, we anticipate the majority of properties would be out of this time period during the first 15 days. So after the first, you know, the first 40-day total period, you know, where the property owner would have to wait before putting their property on the market, there would be, if the property owner accepts the offer, so if the property owner accepts the offer, there would be a 120-day closing period. This additional 120 days would be if and only if the seller agrees. So just to see that this is that the 120 days is in the pink purple text. It's an increase from what was shown in November meetings. And this is based on further conversations with CDFIs, or the nonprofit community development financial institutions, which specialize in lending to nonprofit organizations for affordable housing, and also talking to potential nonprofit affordable housing developers, and that, you know, should they get into this closing period, that they would appreciate more of a buffer to be able to close reliably, to be able to get financing for the properties reliably. This is And again, this is an entirely optional period. You know, this is at the seller's sole discretion whether or not they would choose to sell to the nonprofit period. Okay. Next slide, please. So they're highlighting the, yeah, thank you. Next. So, no, go ahead. The next slide is good. Yes. So this is a similar table to the last one with the timeline elements and the numbers of days in the first two columns, the same as the previous table. The third column is different. And in here, we're showing the types of activities that a potential nonprofit buyer would engage in each phase of the timeline. This figure is to address questions that we had from some folks about why some of these time periods are what they are. And it's to show that nonprofits would have the time to complete each stage of the process, given requirements that are specific to nonprofit governance, as well as sort of general due diligence and applying for financing steps that might be typical to any property transaction, with the added wrinkle of some additional steps for applying for affordable housing from nonprofit funders. So as an example, most nonprofit organizations have rules about governance, which would require their board of directors, their board, to approve to enter into any purchase agreement for real property, or even to submit an offer to purchase a property. So generally, what we want to do is include in the timeline that staff of a nonprofit organization would be able to go to their board and get approval for the transaction. So, like during the letter of intent period, this is for initial financial feasibility. So look at sales comps, but also to determine if the project, in terms of its location, in terms of what could be done, would align with the organization's mission, which is really important for board approval. And then, to initiate contact with their lenders. So if all of that works out, they would submit an offer. They would work with a broker to draft an offer. So we intend or assume that nonprofit organizations would be professionally represented in the real estate transaction. And then typically during, to be able to submit an offer, they would have to seek approval for the board of directors. That they would have to engage vendors for due diligence, and of course, as everything as in all transactions, they would negotiate, and there would be time for negotiation. In the 120-day closing period, like CDFIs, nonprofit lenders, would want the nonprofit to complete a property needs assessment, to verify tenant income when possible, to produce different sort of financial models for how they would operate and hold the property, to submit loan applications. There would need to be time for the lenders to review and approve the application, and time to meet with tenants as applicable as possible. For properties that receive an offer, but the seller does not decide to sell to the nonprofit, there would be an additional before the seller agrees to enter into contract with any other buyer, there would be one last additional 7-day counter offer period for a nonprofit to take one last offer, make one last offer on a property. And again, this would be completely optional to the seller whether or not to accept this offer. And this is a 7-day period because nonprofit would need to be able to test different financial scenarios to see if presumably they could they could pay an increased price from whatever the last offer was. And, you know, if the terms of the deal were significantly different, they'd need to secure additional approvals from their board of directors. Next slide, please. So qualified nonprofits, next slide, thank you. So qualified nonprofit organizations, those organizations, QMPs, we use the abbreviation, who would be eligible to make offers on COPA on properties that would go through the COPA process, will be certified by the housing department per the following. So we will certify QMPs on a regular basis. QMPs must be a nonprofit corporation certified under 501c3 of the federal tax code. QMPs will have successfully acquired and managed a minimum of one, which was previously 3 properties. For those of you who remember, in November also, we tried out a concept of emerging QMPs, but we have, in this latest draft, we have eliminated this concept of emerging QMPs. It's less relevant for people who have not been following all along, but the overall is that QMPs will be certified. We will look at them to make sure that they are, you know, serving the San Jose area, that they're a nonprofit 501c3 area, nonprofit 501c3 organization, and have acquired and managed at least one comparable property. So next slide, and I'll hand the presentation over to Heather.
Thanks, Josh. And just one quick note on that last piece about the changes that were made to the QMP criteria. This was really based on feedback that we heard from community development financial institutions and other potential acquisition lenders. And essentially, we're aligning San Jose's QMP standards with the standards of those organizations to ensure that we are not so that QMPs are not going to miss out on potential funding opportunities from outside of San Jose. So basically trying to make sure that QMPs can access outside funding as well as be QMPs in San Jose. And we can maybe explain more about that if there's questions in the Q&A. But we can move on to talking about affordability. And so I will just say up front, there have been no changes to this since November. So I'm going to go through it very quickly. But COPA would target renter families earning between 30 and 80% of the area median income. For a one-person household, that's currently between $35,000 a year and $94,000 a year. However, it is important to note that there is a no displacement provision in COPA. So if a household has an income that falls outside of those that bracket, they will still be able to stay in a property that is acquired via COPA. So this policy does not exclude people who fall outside of that bracket. So staff are continuing to actively research affordable home ownership for lower income families under COPA. Currently, the proposal is that there would be ownership options for households earning between 60 and 120% of area median income. And there's a strong likelihood that alternative models of home ownership, like limited equity co-ops and community land trusts, would be the models that would serve particularly lower income households when it comes to home ownership. So the next slide. And one more. So just getting into the home ownership a little bit more in depth. So this was something that came up quite a bit during the presentations in November. So it is, we do have some updates on this. The housing department has been working with a consultant who is specialized in this issue to support with fleshing out what the homeownership strategy would look like. I believe that this first bullet, we talked about it last time, but the most likely scenario is that properties that are currently operated as rentals, if there was a conversion to home ownership, that it would happen after acquisition. And based on the feedback we received from the consultant, it would probably be between 2 and 6 years after acquisition. This is really because converting from a rental model to a homeownership model takes a significant amount of time, and it takes more time than what is currently prescribed in the COPA timeline that Josh just reviewed. So in order to allow for an immediate conversion of properties upon acquisition, the timelines for COPA would need to be significantly longer. Another thing just to note, this is, we're just emphasizing this, but I believe it already appeared in a version of the framework. If properties are successfully acquired by QNPs, and if down the road that QNP decides to sell the property, there will be a requirement that the QNP first offer the properties to the tenants for purchase. So that is another way that homeownership would be promoted by COPA. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we're receiving consultant feedback, and there's also simultaneously a broader conversation happening within the housing department about the homeownership strategy, and the homeownership under, conversions from rentals to ownership will be part of that conversation. COPA itself, the ordinance, does not actually authorize funding, right? It is only a change in the protocol for how properties transact. The actual funding will be authorized by a separate document. That's the city's notice of funding availability. And so we raise this now because ultimately the process of converting from rentals to ownership models carries expenses with it. There's a significant amount of labor that needs to occur for that to happen, and a lot of organizing. And so it would require funding. And so that is why we're, saying that the notice of funding availability will really be where more of the information is fleshed out on what exactly the city's support for conversions from rentals to home ownership will be fleshed out. And so that notice of funding availability is for housing preservation, and that's currently in development. Additionally, to maximize transparency, we are doing something that is not necessarily typical, but we're actually going to be posting the consultant memo on the COPA, Housing Department's COPA webpage, so that members of the public can review all of the information that he has provided and can see basically, why we are the support that we have for what we're saying in terms of the conversions are more likely to be happening after the initial acquisition. So next slide, please. And yes, thank you. So tenant empowerment, this piece has also not changed since November, so I will review it only very briefly. COPA will come with a requirement that property owners notify tenants of their intent to sell at the same time that they notify qualified nonprofits. The notification letter is intended to reduce tenant uncertainty, dispel fears about the property sales, provide information regarding tenant rights, clarify that deed-restricted affordable housing would be the result if a COPA acquisition were to occur, and to also provide information about ways of contacting qualified nonprofits and the role that qualified nonprofits would have if they were to support with a COPA acquisition. This kind of notification is consistent with other laws and programs that exist to inform tenants of conditions surrounding their property, the property that they live in. Next slide, please. And so education enforcement incentives, none of this has changed either. So for enforcement, would be a gradual process, starting with a letter if there's a violation, if a property owner violates COPA, escalating to fines connected with other city fee schedules, There's, in terms of education, there will be an extensive outreach process to property owners to ensure that they know about COPA and are able to comply with it, and to tenants as well. For joint partnerships, so this refers to situations where a nonprofit housing provider that wants to do COPA acquisitions but lacks the requisite experience, a partnership where they are working with a more experienced organization. There's a commitment to ensuring that there's program funding sources that can support the more experienced organization in transferring knowledge to the less experienced organization, because that is, there's significant work that is involved with that. And then finally, one thing that we, I believe is already in our framework, but just emphasizing it, is that property owners who sell to qualified nonprofits will receive fee waivers for their San Jose property transfer tax. So that's can be a significant value. It's a total of $7.50 for each $1,000 of property value for smaller properties with lower valuations, and then it's up to $15 per $1,000 of property value for larger properties. So that can be a significant waiver, and that is to is providing an incentive to ensure that they maximize voluntary compliance. And finally, implementation. Next slide, please. And so, yeah, just this is also something that was presented in November, but the housing department is intending, it plans to create a technology tool for property owners to give notice to QNPs. This is really to, try and reduce the amount of, as much of the burden as possible on property owners, that it's as simple and straightforward as possible for them to comply with COPA. It also provides a functionality that can be used where QNPs could specify which types of properties that they might be interested in pursuing. So for example, if they only want to pursue 20+ unit properties, they can specify that. And so if I'm a property owner and I own, for example, a 10-unit property, but none of the qualified nonprofits in San Jose want to go after 10-unit properties, the system would automatically basically say, like, no one is interested. And so you could potentially move forward faster than a 15-day timeline. So this is another way in which we're really trying to limit the amount of time on property owners and reduce, anything that they might be dealing with regard to COPA. So I believe that is, it also provides a means of administering the program and tracking the effectiveness of COPA over time. That is all for my sections. I believe we can move on to, I'll pass it back to Elizabeth.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you to all our speakers. So now we'll transition to our Q&A portion. Thank you all for your patience and hearing our presentation. Just a couple notes on the Q&A portion. If you have a question that you'd like to ask, what you can do is use the raise hand function, which is at the bottom of your screen. I see people already have their hands up, and I know the cue, so that's great. And then you can also have turned the chat function on. And Heather, if you wouldn't mind adjusting the audio settings so people can unmute themselves if needed. And again, just a reminder that, to keep your communication respectful, especially in the chat. And if it gets a bit unruly in the chat, we can of course turn it off. And then because we have so many people here, and it's so great to have so many people, and looks like we have some new people that we haven't engaged with before, we'd like to get to as many people as possible. So when you do have a question, if you would be so kind as to keep your question concise and refrain from, engaging in back and forth and multiple questions, that would be very helpful, just so we can get to as many people as possible. And if you have asked a question already in the Q&A and you have another one, you can raise your hand, but I will prioritize people who we haven't heard from yet. So we can get started. Again, feel free to put your questions in the chat or raise your hand. David, looks like you had your hand up. We'll go David and then Steve and then Cheryl. So David, if you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me? All right.
Yep.
It seems to me that COPA from the very beginning has basically stated that two functions would be made available to the tenants who benefit from a COPA purchase. And that would be equity. And you talked a little bit about ownership. And I was interested in understanding equity, number one, and of course, ownership. But equity, it seems to me, is the growth of income by ownership of a property. So and part of this question is, if you have a tenant who's lived, for instance, 10 years in one of these units, does he have, if he moves, is there some equity that they build up? And the second part of the question is for ownership. Being that you're only moving toward duplexes and fourplexes, and you mentioned that ownership would be in the form of maybe eventually going to condos, the properties and the people are too small for a condominium process. 4 would not be. So if you could elucidate on that, equity and ownership. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, David. I think I'll ask Heather to see if she can respond to the equity and ownership question. And just a reminder for speakers, when you begin talking, if you can identify yourself so we all know who's speaking.
Thanks. Yeah, I can start with part of it, and then I'll pass the second half of the response, maybe off to either Christian or Josh. This is Heather. So for ownership, the ownership piece, and you mentioned the duplexes and the fourplexes and how they're too small for condos. This is something that the consultant has looked into and will be posted online, but for different property types, there's different anticipated models for ownership. For smaller properties, that it can include a tenant in common. That would require that all of the tenants are able to qualify for a loan, so it will not work in every single case. And there's other options that also include for other different property sizes, limited equity housing cooperatives, for example. I will pass off the second part, the equity part, to Kristen, maybe.
Thanks. And this is Kristen. I just wanted to clarify, when we use the phrase equity, we may be using it in two ways. We come at this program from a racial and social equity perspective. And then there is what, David, I think you were referring to, which is the equity that one would build, financial equity, and housing being the greatest source of financial equity for most people. So I just wanted to make that distinction on terms. I agree with what Heather said, and we need to think through some more what our home ownership strategies are going to be and going to look like in different sizes of properties. This is why we asked for consultant help with this, because as you note, David, it's harder to make smaller properties work financially, and that has some implications if people want to buy into a share in a property like that. So I'll just raise that to say that we've been thinking about all of the tools that Heather has said and what the city's role could be in each of those. We're just that more information on that would come forward in the forthcoming home ownership strategy, which we hope to engage consultant help on in the next month or two. And it would be tied to financial assistance from the city. So rather than embedded in this COPA program. But we're trying to make sure that we build this program so that it has an envelope so that other initiatives can fit inside of it, if you will. Hopefully that answered your question, David.
Thank you, Kristen. I see some questions coming into the chat. Thank you. I'm going to go to someone who has their hand raised, Steve, and then I'll also be pulling questions from the chat. So Steve, if you could go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you so much. My name's Steve Hanley. I've been a real estate broker in San Jose since 1971. That's what, 51 years. And I had the pleasure of brokering or supervising people for maybe 5,000 real estate transactions. And what I found is that to have a successful transaction, you got to have a willing buyer and a willing seller. Okay. And if you don't have a willing party on either side, you're not going to have a transaction. And what I've found is, and my question is related to, is the term option. Okay. Options have value. They've been created over the centuries, and I believe are very common in real estate law and practice, to have a dollar value. And the purpose of an option is really to protect a seller. And what I'm hearing, and this is my first time that I've been able to listen to the COPA presentations, is everything is geared towards the acquirer of property, as opposed to the person who would not forfeit, but would be selling the property. In other words, the owner. And the purpose of an option is to set up a dollar amount that in case the option is not fulfilled, the seller has protection. And for instance, it may be 40 days that you're talking about as far as this QNP, right? But it's really 167 days, because the 120 days of the escrow period, at the end of the 120, they could fail to get the loan, or for any number of reasons back out of the deal. And when people do that, the forfeiture of either the option or the purchase money deposit is what becomes the question. During that 167 days, the seller may be in an exchange. They may be in an inheritance situation where they need the money to pay taxes. They may have the right to some kind of great financial or personal investment or opportunity that they may be losing. In other words, they have an interest in a successful transaction that they may not have the opportunity to succeed in, because there's a buyer that's been dictated to them to have a right that they don't really have control over. And that's my question here.
Okay.
Who or how
I can
is
respond
the
to
city going to allow for the option being given to these QNPs to put up money that can be forfeit? Because it is an option, and I believe is constitutionally, or should be constitutionally, a right that these potential sellers should be able to insist on. And I don't see that in the discussion anywhere.
Okay.
If I were one of these duplex or fourplex owners, I'd insist on it. And if somebody weren't willing to give me a forfeitable option piece, and the city demanded I put it in escrow, I'd be at my attorney in a nanosecond. Can you answer that question?
Yes, I can
Yeah.
answer that
Oh, go ahead,
question.
Josh.
This is Josh from City of San Jose. So first off, the only non-optional periods for a seller would be the first 15-day period plus the first and the 25-day period. So those would be non-optional. Proceeding beyond the letter of interest period and then the offer period would be completely up to the seller. And the seller, so we would not be forcing the seller to enter into escrow with anybody that they didn't want to enter into escrow. So the seller would not be required to sell to anybody who they didn't want to sell. They would be a willing seller.
But there's still that period of time where he has to deal with the QNP.
There's a,
That's optionable.
there is the law will require, yes, the law will require an initial 15-day letter of interest period and a 25-day option,
I
offer
keep
period.
getting unmuted.
Right.
You haven't answered the question. It's
Right, right,
unfair.
I'm still going. And then once if the seller elects to transact with a nonprofit organization, they would enter escrow with terms agreed upon with the nonprofit organization, as would proceed in any normal transaction. So there can be a non-refundable deposit, or there can be like options priced in that transaction. There could be different payments by the nonprofit into escrow, as you're discussing, but that would happen after the first 40-day period.
You are taking a 40-day right to an option away from me. I do not believe that would be constitutional. Please solve that 40-day right for me to have a forfeiture period, because the 40 days could mean any number of different negative impacts to me as the owner of that property.
Steve,
I have not heard an answer.
Yeah, we
Well, no,
respect
the
your,
answer is that there will be this 40-day period, that's the part of the program design. It is designed that way to give initial foot in the door for a nonprofit organization.
Well, I'm sorry, sir. I don't take you as being a judge.
Right. And so this is something that could potentially be adjudicated, but this is something that exists in other markets. And
so can that
has
be
not
presented
been-
to the council as a potential viable negative to this proposal?
I'm just going to interrupt here before you respond, Josh, just
I
to
think
keep
that's a
us,
legitimate question for the citizens of San Jose to get an answer to.
Steve, I appreciate your questions, but as I mentioned earlier, we do have many people that we'd like to get to, and we respect that you may not disagree. You may disagree with our
Do the
responses.
citizens have that right?
You definitely have a right to ask questions and get responses, but we are going to ask that you refrain from further questions after Josh gives his response.
Why?
So we
'Cause you
can
can't
move
answer them?
on. Thank you. And we're going to have Josh answer. Thank
Farce.
I mean, this can be part of what the council considers. Yes, clearly. But as I said, this is something that exists in other markets and has not been found unconstitutional in those places.
Right. And I just want to add one sentence. This is Kristen. Steve, as a private party, you're welcome to set your own hurdle price, your own terms and conditions. It's completely up to you. So this is a process and a procedure.
Not if I don't have a right to an option fee.
There is no technical option that is being conveyed. It is only a process, but I appreciate
You're calling it an
your
option.
thoughts.
You're calling it an
actually,
option.
we didn't call anything an option. I think you're
COPA.
your real estate
What's the
knowledge
O
is
for?
interpreting it that way, perhaps. So, but thank you.
You've
for your-
unmuted me because
thank you
I've
for your
got you
thoughts.
in a corner.
Steve, I'm sorry, you're finding your behavior to be very disruptive, and I am going to unmute you. And if you continue to interrupt, I will remove you from the meeting. So please respect our ability to have a conversation here and have other people answer the questions, get their questions answered as well.
We got your comment down. Thank you. Thanks, Elizabeth.
Let's move on to Cheryl, and then I'll take a question from the chat. Cheryl, if you could unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I have a question, I think, which we were already discussing, which is very important to me anyway. So I'm still trying to understand this thing about this so you have a thing in the program description about over-income tenants. And so part of the question is, does an over-income tenant mean somebody who makes more than the 80%? Or does an over-income tenant means somebody who is not paying at least 30% of their income for rent? Okay, so with that question, in the program ordinance, it says that the rent increase can only be under COPA 5% or the restricted affordable rent, whichever is less. But it also says there's an exception for over income tenants, whatever that definition may be. The QNP can set their rent at 30% of their income, meaning that they don't have to obey this 5% rule. It says here, QNP can set their rent at 30% of the household's income or their current rent, whichever is higher. And then below it says that's an exception from the 5% rule. So who are the over income? Are they people who make more than 80%? Or are they people who don't pay 30% of their rent? And what is this exception? It sounds like over income tenants do not apply for the 5% and their rent could be just jacked up.
I can take that answer. Hi, Cheryl. Yeah, trying to get clear on how the rules would work. Over income, you're correct in interpreting. It is somebody who has a higher income than the income band target that we're talking about for the program. Maybe Heather can chime in to confirm if that is 80% as we'd presented the proposal.
Sorry, just the question is the 80% the
What's the proposal for the income band currently for the rental?
right? Yeah, it's 30 to 80% of area
30
median.
to 80, right?
Yep.
So Cheryl, if somebody is a current tenant and makes 100% of area median income, the proposal would be that that person gets to stay and leave whenever they choose to, but that their rent would become 30% of their income to have the same standard as the other residents in the property.
So their rent could immediately become 30%.
No, we had talked remember on the technical committee and with the strategic advisory committee, we had talked about making sure that no one person experiences a huge increase in rent. So the intention would be for their rent to gradually rise, not all at once in a shock.
So even if they're paying $2,000 now, but based on their income, they should be paying $4,000, would be 30%. You would just do only 5% a year until they hit $4,000 a month.
I'd have to ask the team if that is if we had said in the past that the 5% limit would apply to everybody.
See, that's
or if there was something, yeah, this is a very kind of little narrow question. And
well, it's not really narrow because it's a big deal. If you're
I know, and you're right, because I think we're on the same page. We're trying to prevent huge rent spikes to anybody at a given year, whether they be at this income or slightly higher.
And it clearly says in here in the proposal, it says annual rent increase, 5% or whatever the affordable is. But it says there's an exception for over income tenants, people like somebody who might be making 100% API, that their rent could be set at 30%. It's an exception to the 5%. So according to what you have written here and the way I see it, it says those people could get like a 20% increase as soon as you buy.
That's not correct. We are not aiming to have anybody with a 30% increase at one time, as an example. That's against the idea of the program. What is missing from that description is probably another sentence that says for people who are over income and need to have their base rent adjusted upwards, what would the phase-in period be? So again, under law, it can't be more than around 10% in 1 year. So you're in a band between 5 and 10%.
Right.
So, but again, the point is to minimize price shocks to everybody, not just the lowest income renters.
Right. So
so I don't know if you have a suggestion on what that appropriate percentage increase would be, let us know. And that's a helpful tidbit that somehow we need that detail in the framework spelled out too.
Yeah, if we could get that if you guys could kind of fix that in there, because if you're saying the maximum is 10, then, if you can give 10% a year for, until they reach so if they're paying 2,000 and then you can give them, what is that, 200?
Yeah, I think it would be less than that, but thank you for noting that we need to clarify that, Cheryl.
Kind of fix
it. And if you have a percentage in mind or anybody else does saying, 6% would be okay, but 8% would be too much, please let us know.
Yeah, because if somebody's living in a rent controlled apartment right now, and then you guys buy it under COPA and all of a sudden they're getting 10% rent increase a year.
Well, that's the outlier occupant. we expect that the vast majority of people are going to see rent decreases or rents stabilized and would not be escalating at 5% a year necessarily. And certainly would not start at the levels that they're at now. So we think most residents could see a rent decrease or a rent, level set.
Yeah.
So
there-
I know this is one of your.
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
it-
Cheryl, sorry
Thanks for
to
that, Cheryl.
interrupt,
We got
Cheryl,
that.
but
Anyway,
we've
if
had a lot of back and
yeah,
forth, and
if we can address that moving forward.
we've noted that. Yeah, definitely. And we
Yeah,
appreciate your
Thanks for noting
questions.
that.
Okay.
And
thanks.
again, just for everyone else too, I mean, just again, we really appreciate if you could keep your questions concise, that we've got our queue lined up here, and we want to make
Yeah,
sure we
well,
can
I
get to
try.
everybody.
Like, this is tenants who could be getting huge rent increases, so it's important.
Yeah, we are not proposing huge rent increases for anybody.
And the
I just want to
proposal-
clarify. Thank you, Cheryl.
Thanks,
Okay.
Cheryl. Okay, I'm going to take a question from the chat. Leticia asked a question earlier in Spanish. And so Leticia, if you want to unmute yourself, but I can read out your question. I mean, you wrote it in Spanish, but translated, it is, what would the hypothetical properties of COPA? If you have anything to add to your question, you can unmute. Otherwise, perhaps Heather might want to answer what types of properties would be under COPA.
Sorry, I wasn't sure if we were waiting for translation. Yeah, so I think the question is like what properties are hypothetically to be purchasable under COPA. So this would be these are going to be properties with lower income tenants, tenant families who are at risk of displacement. Ultimately, it's the universe of properties could be any property that is 2 or more units that doesn't meet one of the exceptions, and it will basically be up to the qualified nonprofits which properties to proceed with pursuing. I hope that answers that question.
Great, thank you, Heather. Let's move on to the next person who has a hand raised. Anil, if you could unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi there. Thank you for allowing me to ask a few questions. They're just going to be very straightforward. One, I noticed when I logged onto this meeting that it's being recorded. Will this recording this meeting be made available to everyone?
Yes, and most of our past meetings have been available on our website.
Kristen, you made a comment earlier on in your presentation that market timelines move quickly. Did I capture that correctly?
More quickly in our market than in some.
How do you define quickly?
You mean the metric, days on market?
Yeah, how would you define? I mean, if that's a metric,
what's the question underlying that, Anil?
I want to know how you define quickly. I mean, I want to know what metric you're using to define market timelines and how that metric is, how quickly is what's your definition of quickly?
Is that because we're trying to figure out why we need to address the timeline?
I want to understand. It's a simple question, Kristen. I just want to know.
I don't think I have a ruler that says this is quickly and this is not quickly.
So
this is a robust real estate market and rents escalate significantly. So I think quickly is also in the eye of the beholder, as Josh explained, what's involved for a nonprofit to get financing and to make an offer and go to their board and talk to their lenders and all of those things. It's a little different than for a market rate.
Okay, so then you reference rents are escalating quickly. When you say market timelines, are you talking about how quickly it takes to sell a building?
Yes. Yeah.
So that's unrelated to
sell a building. Mm-hmm.
That's unrelated to rents escalating quickly, I would imagine.
Rents escalating quickly, and yeah, correct. They're not causative, but they're related.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I mean, I would push back on market timelines move quickly. I mean, I think you have to separate the single family home resale market from the multifamily resale market. They're two different things, and they definitely aren't anything alike. My next question is related to this notion that nonprofits can turn these properties into for sale units. I was under the impression, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you would need to condo map buildings in order to qualify them as resale. Is that not true?
Yes, if they were turning into condos, you're right. You'd have to record a condo map. You'd have to file white papers with the state. There are a number
So
of
this is a
steps.
TIC, so it's going to operate differently then?
I don't believe
I mean,
tenancy in commons going to, yeah, I don't believe TICs have to condo map. That's a technical question, though. Maybe someone knows the answer to. I don't believe TICs are going to be a common vehicle in our market, because every person who's borrowing money has to jointly rely on the others borrowing money to perform. And that's difficult. So that's difficult in any market. Yeah, so that's why we have to hash through kind of the size of buildings and the steps that would be involved, like condo mapping. And then, going under the condo conversion ordinance and figure out like what are likely paths for different sizes of buildings. That's why we've got help doing that.
Thank you. Thank you,
Wait,
Kristen.
I have one last question. I thought Joshua was gonna
Okay, if you could just say your last question so we can move on. But
last
next.
question is, you mentioned that the nonprofits may at some point decide to resell their property. Are they allowed to capture the full equity that they have that the property has gone up by value in, and keep that equity, or they have to return some of that equity to the city?
Oh, gosh, we hadn't even thought of that. Generally, when properties are sold, there's an appraisal involved with a fair market value assessment, including the recorded restrictions. And so we, as a lender, for instance, to that property, would want to see that that procedure was followed. Did that make sense?
I mean, if you take a BMR and someone buys a BMR and then they sell it, they're not allowed to capture the entire amount of equity or the entire amount of valuation that the property is inflated by. So would a nonprofit be able to, let's say they buy a building for $1 million?
Oh, I see.
They sell for $2 million. Are they allowed to capture the full $1 million in equity, or they have to share that with the city?
Josh, you look like you wanted to respond.
Well, it kind of depends on when they're selling and what financing or support has been recorded against the property from the city. If the property has been restricted as affordable housing, those restrictions would most likely, in most cases, continue with the sale as if they haven't expired already. I mean, this is actually like a really complicated question that you're asking. I mean, I think in general, we would want to make sure our goal in this as a city would to be make sure that the property stays as affordable housing, or is or stays with the residents, and to the most important thing that we'd be protecting is that residents would be able to stay in the building and to to achieve the goals of the program for residential stability. In most cases, if the city has put money into it, there would be additional controls that the city would have that that they wouldn't just be able to recognize the profits. But it's kind of a complicated question as to when it gets sold and what's happening.
And how much repayment the city would require on the resale if there were net proceeds. Right, it looks different than BMR single family loan docs, but the concept is similar. Would we require some repayment if there was a net positive cash flow, from the sale? So I'm happy to get it. We are happy to get it more on a side meeting.
The general answer is no, they would not be able to, but there may be some instances where they could recognize some of the profits, but it's very technical.
And the deed restrictions, bring down the value of the property. Frankly.
Yes, all of that. So
after they're put on later. Yeah.
So something we can discuss further, but maybe right now our time is best served going through more questions.
Thanks, Anil. Selma, you have your hand raised. If you could unmute yourself and ask your question. Selma, are you still with us?
Perdón, ¿es Salma o Selma?
Selma Angeles. Yeah, we can hear you.
Sí, Selma.
Yeah, sorry. Okay, go ahead.
Sí, mi nombre es Selma Ángeles. Fui residente de San José por más de 20 años y líder de vecinos activos con Somos Makers. Y se sabe que los inversiones y desarrolladores se están aprovechando de nuestras comunidades para su propio beneficio. Esto está mal. Esas acciones afectan negativamente a nuestro vecindario al obligar a los residentes a trabajar en 3 trabajos para llegar al fin de mes. Vivir en sus automóviles y gastar mucho más de 30% de sus ingresos en alquiler. Estamos en la última política de COPA redactada por la ciudad de San José. No incluye los siguientes puntos clave. Elija uno de los siguientes. Las organizaciones sin fines de lucro cualificadas emergentes deberían poder solicitar por seguir propiedades que superan los 5 unidades, los tamaños y las propiedades demasiado específicos de la organización sin fines de lucro. Cualifica emergentes, crean barreras adicionales. Las organizaciones sin fines de lucro cualifican, deberán tener al menos 2 proyectos de vivienda terminados para ser considerados bajo COPA. El momento de mejorar nuestras condiciones de vivienda es ahora. Juntos podemos tener un gran éxito. Gracias.
I'm not sure if I totally understood that question, but I think it was with regard to the emerging qualified nonprofits category that we had discussed in November, and with regard to the experience of the nonprofit housing providers that can become qualified nonprofits. I'll just say that the emerging qualified nonprofit category has been eliminated since November. So that is no longer going to be part of the proposal. And this was in response to feedback that we heard from lenders in our area, and essentially how it seemed like it would be an unnecessarily restrictive category for newer potential qualified nonprofits. I hope that answers your question, Selma.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you, Selma.
Gracias.
Okay, thank you. Lorena, you're next. If you could unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yo solamente quiero decir algo. Mi nombre es Lorena Cortés, soy residente del Distrito 7 y líder de vecinos activos en Somos Makers. He llamado hogar a San José durante 30 años, después de emigrar de México. San José es mi hogar, porque he visto crecer a mis hijos, donde duramente hemos trabajado hasta en 3 trabajos, y donde tengo amigos y familiares con los que sé que puedo contar en la ciudad. No, sin embargo, con la incertidumbre de una vivienda segura, estable y accesible, he visto a muchos de mis familiares y amigos irse de San José. Instamos a que la última política de COPA redactada por la ciudad de San José opte porque los propietarios deban notificar a los inquilinos que la propiedad está a la venta a los inquilinos. Que deben de participar durante todo el proceso.
Lorena, we're having a hard time hearing you, and the interpreter's having a hard time interpreting. Could you possibly maybe adjust so you could speak a little louder or get closer to the microphone?
No.
¿Ya me escuchan?
Un poquito solamente.
¿Está bien así?
We can try. Vamos a intentar.
¿Ya estoy bien o no? Todavía no. ¿Todavía no me escuchan?
Está bien, está bien.
Yeah, that's better. Go ahead.
Decía que mi nombre es Lorena Cortés. Soy residente del Distrito 7 y líder de vecinos activos. Con Somos México. He llamado para San José durante 30 años después de emigrar de México a San José. San José ¿ya? No. Donde he visto crecer a mis hijos y hay amigos y familiares con los que puedo contar en la ciudad, no sin embargo, con la incertidumbre de una vivienda segura, estable y accesible, he visto a muchos de mis familiares y amigos irse de San José. Instamos a que la última política de COPA redactada por la ciudad de San José opte por los propietarios, que deben de notificar a los inquilinos que la propiedad está a la venta y a los inquilinos deben de participar durante todo el proceso de la COPA. Que la capital de Silicon Valley no debe de dar la espalda a los residentes que siguen siendo la columna vertebral de esta ciudad. Tenemos todo el derecho de exigir mejor vida para nuestras familias, porque al igual que otras personas pagamos impuestos, sin importar nuestra situación. Nos hemos esforzado para seguir adelante y hacer de nuestra ciudad más fuerte. No es nuestra culpa que nosotros luchemos para llevar al fin de mes. Los residentes de San José merecemos algo mejor y que juntos vamos a luchar para mantener a nuestras familias alojadas en San José. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Lorena. And thank you to the interpreter. Okay, I had a hard time with your background noise. So thank you. And I don't think that we had a question in there, but we'll go ahead and move on to our next question. Asker Dimitri, if you could unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you. Actually, I have a comment rather than a question, and I will be brief. My perspective is as a realtor and a property rights advocate. The idea of COPA is flawed and rotten at its very foundation. What we heard from the presenters is that the reason for COPA is that nonprofits cannot compete in the open market. And because of that, we have to give them a special pass and just stop the market for them. This is cheating, plain and simple. This is unfair to the homeowners who would be deprived of their rights to sell their properties to whoever they want on their own terms. Don't do any of this. If you want to preserve housing, do it fairly. Don't try to cheat the market. Instead of enacting these unnecessary and unfair regulations, help the housing nonprofits compete on the open market. Give them the funding to make competitive offers and coach them to work with qualified real estate professionals who would help them acquire property fairly and equitably. The current COPA proposal needs to be scrapped completely. Thank you.
Thank you, Dimitri. Our next question asker is Catherine Hedges. Please go ahead and unmute yourself, Catherine.
Thanks very much. My name is Catherine Hedges. I'm a resident in District 3. I live in affordable housing, and I'm a leader with Sacred Heart Housing Action Committee. SHAC is a member of the People's Agenda Coalition, and we support Somos Mayfair in their support of COPA. And during the 6 years I've lived in San Jose, I've witnessed the effects of displacement. I've seen friends leave the city, so many people in the art community, volunteers, community members. I've been in a lot of groups where I get testimony from people whose family has had to move out of the city. And we know that one of the reasons we had such high COVID mortality in the East Side is so many families having to have multiple families in one house and working multiple jobs out with the public. And This shows why we deserve safe, stable, and affordable housing to ensure that we can build a sustainable future for the next generations. And the coalition thanks the city of San Jose for the updates in the latest COPA policy that include the 120-day closing period, eliminate the emerging QMP category, and the plans to inform tenants of pathways to tenant ownership. And those are important to the success of COPA and must not be negotiated away. Housing is a human right. Profiting real estate transactions is not. We should not be trying to preserve the rights of REITs to buy our housing stock easily.
Thank you, Catherine. Our next person in line is Melanie Griswold. If you could unmute yourself.
Hi there, thanks. So I have a couple questions. The first question I've got, and maybe this was already covered in your presentation on the slides, but with respect to the properties that are eligible and the tenants that are we're trying to protect, how do you propose that you identify which of the properties would actually have qualifying tenants, the ones that we want to protect from displacement versus people that maybe do have higher incomes?
Okay, Melanie, we can definitely answer that. If you have your other questions ready, if you wouldn't mind asking them now, and then we can respond all at once and move on. I'm just trying to keep us on track here.
Okay, so then the second question I've got is about the ongoing funding mechanism. So, I heard that the rent, you were thinking that the rents might actually go down. I'm not sure how that could possibly happen with where expenses are at and the fact that rents really don't even cover the cost of typical mortgage, or rents are not covering the cost on single families. So when we have rents that are presumably going to be lower at the same level as they are today, what is the mechanism to cover the shortfall for that, and going into the future too? And then the third question I've got is about the displacement chart that you initially put up with showing the displacement. And my question is the displacement that's disproportionately impacting minorities, is that because there's just more minorities and people of color who are living in rental units in general? And so if we, kind of look at this problem of displacement and we try and prevent displacement, are we also taking a lot of potential land that could be redeveloped with more units, potentially all affordable projects, and taking away the opportunity to have that land available for producing more housing? Especially when we're looking at single families and duplexes and maybe properties where you don't have that many. Not to say that for that tenant household that's being displaced, it's not important, but if you're looking at sort of a macro of displacing one or two tenants in order to be able to have a 100-unit building that's producing 15% or maybe 100% affordable, it seems like we need to look at, is this policy going to prevent the production of housing?
Got it. Let me try to really quickly go through three answers. And I know we only have a few minutes left, so I think folks who are trying to ask a question, if you could limit it to maybe your most important question. How do we choose properties that would have most likelihood of unstable households? We'd be looking at the urban displacement project ratings on different census tract areas and figuring out where we should focus our notice of funding availability dollars. We'll also be looking at what the median incomes are in those areas versus what the rents are in those areas. So we'd have to be smart about where to target our limited dollars. How could rents go down? You bring up a really good point. Rents have to cover expenses. If for some reason rents were too low to cover expenses, obviously there would have to be rental subsidies in addition, or potentially capitalized subsidies that could be drawn down over time. And third, and we're talking multifamily now, not single family mortgages, single family homes would not be covered by this program. Third is how do we feel about having COPA preserve buildings that are on sites that maybe could be redeveloped and get a lot more intense? I think that was your question. You bring up a good question because we have to produce affordable housing as well as preserve people in existing units. I think the question of where the city would put a lot of dollars out, you're right. We wouldn't be trying to save a duplex next to a site that we knew could be, 10 or 15 stories. We have to have some sense of compatible uses. So I think the question about where we choose to target the funds again would come through the NOFA, but you bring up the basic struggle that we always struggle with, which is, how do we both preserve people and keep them in place, but also develop, which is something that the city has been really behind in the past. So all good questions, Melanie. Thanks for your thoughts. Back to Elizabeth.
Okay, thanks. Let's hear from Ruth next. Ruth, if you could unmute yourself and ask your question. Ruth Callahan, if you're still with us, if you could unmute yourself and ask your question, and if you can limit it just to one question as we're trying to get through everyone.
I guess Ruth stepped away. Maybe we can go to the next person.
Yeah. Next person is Kimmy. Kimmy, if you would unmute yourself and ask your question.
My question is, city already spent time to create rent control and just cause, and we also have Section 8 housing vouchers for a lot of people, like low-income individuals. And now COPA wants to take these same properties and convert them to low-income only. The tenant already protected when a new owner purchased the building. But if nonprofit are going to be purchasing properties and they have the funding, they should try it on the open market. They shouldn't force first right to offer and counter offer on the owners. I also have a second question is how they can balance the cost if it's going to benefit the low income individual to buy the COPA housing. If there is a roof leak, if the driveway need to be replaced, the big ticket item could cost up to sometimes 20,000, driveway could be up to 60,000. Who is going to pay for this? And also for, the bureaucracy running for the operation for those buildings, it's going to add up. Right now, for a small mom and pop property owners, they don't make much money. They, some of them just barely make it even when the interest rate is low. Now they are going to face a higher interest rate. Then, is their profit going to be totally removed? And they are running it themselves and they are not getting paid. And right now you want, the bureaucracies to run it. Those employee salary could add up to the expense. Who is going to pay for the loss on the operation? Are you going to have taxpayer to chip in to repair the roof, the driveway, all the ticket items? Yeah.
Thanks, Kimmy. If I could try to answer quickly, and I don't know if Josh chime in after this. You bring up the good point again, that it's not easy to operate some properties and it is very small margins. We did take down your point is that that COPA wouldn't be necessary for nonprofits to buy properties on the open market. So we understand that that's your position, and we received that feedback. Thanks. Mom and pops would be subject to rising rates. Actually, but nonprofits would also be subject to rising rates. A given property would have to make sense financially for someone to pursue, for a nonprofit to pursue, just as if they do the same work in many ways as a private developer does. Every deal has to see, they have to see if it's financially feasible. But I think 2 points. Why is this warranted? It's because the city would be working to try to help get more organizations that have the public objectives that the city has, which is to put more units into permanent ongoing affordability. And so that's why we are proposing this program as a solution to a few different challenges and the way to get at that goal. So I would say one other thing, which is that if mom and pops, if existing owners choose to sell their buildings, we believe that this program, especially in times of recession or times of high interest rates, could provide a pipeline of potential buyers that would not be there if it was just private market offerings. And we saw that work in the last downturn. So with that, Josh, any final comment, or we'll turn it back to Elizabeth?
Just one really quick thing, that nonprofits that purchase the property, most of them would also be coming to the city, and this is what Heather was talking a little bit about during the presentation about the NOFA, or the Notice of Funding Availability. But nonprofits would likely be coming to the city outside of COPA to get money for rehabilitation, so that there would be an initial rehabilitation of the property to fix it up and replace, if the roof is damaged, if there's long-term deferred maintenance to replace the roof, things like that, et cetera.
And I think one final thing is that the qualified nonprofits are going to be required to have operational reserves in order to ensure that there is money available in case, the roof starts leaking, in case there are major maintenance issues. And all of these things go into the financial models that will be prepared during the acquisition period. And
Thank you, Heather,
not just by the nonprofit, but also reviewed by the lenders.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you for that direct question. I forgot to write down. Thank you for that.
And thank you, Kimmy, for your question. I'm just going to
have an additional question.
Kimmy, if you don't mind.
I'm sorry, Kimmy, we have to move on because there are several people who haven't gotten a question in yet.
Because this is very important too.
Kimmy, I'm sorry. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. I'm sorry, but we do need to move on. And actually, I need to just do a little pause in our presentation.
Because there is a big hole in what you just say, because you.
Kimmy, I apologize, but I'm going to unmute you, or excuse me, unmute you. I do need to do a time check. We're at 4:03. Our meeting is meant to end at 4, and I apologize that we've run over. We do appreciate all your questions. I do need to ask, staff are able to stay and go on a little bit more. If people have to go, obviously, if you need to leave the meeting, that's fine. I put the survey in the chat. I do need to check with our interpreters though, because they may have other obligations and maybe other things that they are meant to be doing. So if you're an interpreter, if you could chat to me, you can chat to me directly, but if you're able to stay, if not, that's totally fine. We can make accommodations. And then we'll see who can stay and if we can continue our interpretation. I don't think if we can't have our Spanish interpreter stay, I'm not sure we should stay much longer so that everyone would not have the benefit of being able to hear this presentation.
The request would be another 15 minutes. That's it. We need to try to keep our word on the timeline for these meetings, but we also don't want to leave a lot of people without an opportunity to ask questions who have not spoken already.
Okay. Just getting these messages in. Again, thank you all to have come. If you wouldn't mind filling out the feedback survey, we really appreciate your feedback on these meetings. Karen, if you wouldn't mind just going to the last slide so people can see what's next in terms of the following meetings and where they can get more information. Okay, again, interpreters, if you would be willing to chat me and say if you are able to stay. Rosario, I see that you cannot. Understood. Yeah, well,
Do we know? Can we go a little longer?
no, I'm sorry, we can't. The Spanish interpreters have to go. I know there are people who here who are using Spanish interpretation, so.
Understand. Well, that's right. Elizabeth, do you want to wrap us up? And we can do this. We can keep the chat open a little bit longer if people who want to make a comment and, you know, virtual writing it on a Post-it and leaving that with us, feel free to use the chat as we can stay for a few extra minutes so that we can get your comments in. But Elizabeth, do you want to go back to wrap us up?
Sure. So I put our survey in the chat. Let us know how we did. We have our email here. Also, if you're not able to get your question, you know, we apologize to those people who have not had their question answered. We can put in the chat where you can message us. And I think that's it. Is there a next slide, Karen? I thought I had something here on our next meeting. Nope. Okay. Yeah, here we go. Next, we are also having an in-person meeting next Wednesday from 6 to 8. I'll also put the registration here in the chat. It's going to be at the Mayfair Center. Again, I appreciate everyone coming. We apologize again for our time management here. Kristen, if you want to send us off.
Yeah, I mean, we just really appreciate everybody. I know we heard comments both pro and con against the program today. We heard ideas about how the rules could be clarified and different other ideas. So we're taking all of that and we're keeping all of your feedback, and we are working on presenting a balanced picture going forward of what this program could do and the benefits that we think it could have, as well as some of the concerns of the community. So please be aware that, you know, as staff, our job is to work to advance things that we believe would help, but it's also to get feedback from an array of different people and to reflect a balanced feedback to the decision makers. We are not the decision makers. As Martha O'Connell would say, she did not elect us, she elected the city council. So anyway, that is what we are trying to do. And we appreciate you coming and being here with us today. So please take the survey. Please feel free to come to the in-person session. It will be very similar to this one. And we're going to try to make that one hybrid, but we're not clear yet if that will work. We know we'll be there in person though. So with that, we appreciate your involvement. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Please also be on the lookout for any more notifications about you know, we've committed to post on our website a couple more documents. So we'll be doing that. And we will likely try to have at least one more online meeting in addition to the January 25th in-person meeting.
Great. Thank you all.